Hello everyone and welcome to another Stargate lore video. This video, while not requested, was suggested by once again House Hendo. Don't worry, we will get to other people soon enough. In the meantime, today we're going to be talking about the Tegallians.
They don't get along so good.
Also, before we begin, so one of the factions for this group is known as the Rand Protectorate, but it's spelled like this with a D, and I tried my hardest to say Ran and not Rad, but I may have let it slip once or twice, so I apologize. And to the writers of Stargate, why? Why would you do this? There's so many other ways you could have spelled Ran, but you chose it with a D of all things? History. The Tegallians were one of the many groups of humans the Goa'uld had taken as slaves and spread throughout the Milky Way galaxy, selling them on the planet of Tegalus. At some point, the Goa'uld left Tegalus, either abandoning the planet or being driven off in some sort of rebellion. Between then and first contact with Earth, we know two countries had formed, the Rad Protectorate and the Caledonian Federation, who had developed a deep distrust and rivalry with each other. This resulted in a decades-long Cold War, which resulted in both nations having the ability to completely wipe the other out. In 2004, Stargate Command made contact with the Rad Protectorate, but since their gate was in a museum, they had no way to keep it a secret from the general population or the Caledonians. While there were talks between Ran, Caledonia, and Earth, a situation quickly developed in Ran. A religious fundamentalist named Soren, who believed the activation of the gate proved the gods to be real, began uniting the various factions of other religious zealots in Ran, and over the course of roughly 2 months began taking over various cities and military installations, effectively plunging Ran into civil war. Caledonia not helping any matters by threatening that if Soren took control, they would consider it an act of war. Daniel had returned to the world to try and help them mediate this out, but when a Rand missile facility was believed to be taken by Soren, Caledonia launched an attack to destroy all of Rand's missile facilities to prevent any more of them from falling into Soren's hands. But Soren did have control of at least one missile facility and launched a counterattack, and the situation quickly fell into full-scale war. Within a few days, all of Rand's cities were destroyed with only a fraction of the population surviving, those in the outlying areas. Soren then took control of Ran, with Caledonia in no position to stop him. While in control, he renamed the country to Avada, which in an ancient Goa'uld dialect means the gods are just, and set up some kind of provisional government. But in practice, he was the military dictator of the country. While also in power, he prevented Stargate Command from sending rescue teams to look for Daniel, who was trapped on the planet when the war broke out, claiming that they would scare the population. He did travel to Earth to negotiate, but instead of taking the food and medical supplies they offered, he wanted the military weapons so he could go on to conquer Caledonia and spread the message of the gods. Eventually, Daniel made contact with Stargate Command via radio, and along with the remaining loyalist forces to the old government, launched an attack on the bunker where Soren was, ultimately defeating him when Kane shot him. Though Daniel was not very happy with this, as he feared Kane had just made a martyr. Although from what we see later, this didn't end up happening. Before Daniel left, he promised that Earth would help Rand rebuild. Sometime after this, Rand stopped replying to Earth's communications, with Earth assuming they just didn't want help anymore. In reality, a prior had come and offered not only Rand religion, but a weapon they could use to destroy the Caledonians. When the weapon became operational, they used it to destroy a Caledonian military installation, and gave Caledonia 5 days to surrender to military occupation. And before you jump to the Caledonians' defense, I should note there was evidence that Caledonia was planning their own invasion on Rand. I should also note that the prior had unleashed a plague on Rand while they were deciding whether or not to accept Origin, curing only those who would accept the Ori. Jared Kane feared another global war and sought the help of Stargate Command, informing them of the situation. Initially, they had planned to destroy the satellite, but when the Rand Protectorate sent a message saying they wanted to talk, they decided to let Dan and Jared go and see what they wanted to say, and if they didn't hear back from them, continue with their plan to destroy the satellite. When Daniel and Jared returned to Tegalus, they were promptly arrested and thrown in prison, with Jared being charged with treason and both being declared enemies of the state.
Excuse me? You allowed us to come here under false pretenses?
Is that legal?
I will make it legal.
Stargate Command proceeded with their plan to send the Prometheus to destroy the satellite, but the weapon proved to be more powerful than they thought, and the Prometheus was sadly destroyed. Those on board who did not die found sanctuary in Caledonia and work with them to destroy the satellite. They found a way to do this, but just as they were about to do it, Daniel offered them a deal. In exchange for not destroying the satellite, Rand would give Caledonia the Stargate, and those who did not want to follow Origin would be allowed to leave. While Caledonia accepted the deal, President Nadala tried to go back on it, but was shot by Commander Goran, who himself was shot by some guards, and in the end the weapon wasn't fired. Sadly, however, after Earth left, the talks broke down as Caledonia didn't want to leave their world, and they launched an attack on Rand, which resulted in a counterattack by Rand, and the Stargate is presumed buried in the rubble of the resulting war, with presumably both countries and possibly the people of the world all being destroyed. Factions. There were 3 factions that made up the Tegallians. The first 2 were the governments of the Rand Protectorate and the Caledonian Federation, though we don't really know much about these governments. With the Rand Protectorate, we really can't come to any conclusions based on their name because Protectorate is not a form of government, though we do know they have a president and a senator, which would imply they have a senate of some kind. In general, this all implies they are some sort of democratic republic, but it is important to note this was only after Soren's takeover, so there was a chance the government was changed since then. I should also note the fandom page says Commander Gareth was the leader of the Protectorate, but I think it's more he was the leader of the military, not the government. With the Caledonians, we can assume that their government was some sort of federation with a minister as their head of state, which we know existed both before the war and after. Mitchell says this line about the two.
Tegalans. Post-apocalyptic warring superpowers with deep-seated political differences.
At first I wasn't sure what differences he was talking about, because at first glance there don't seem to be any political differences, they just seem to dislike each other because they do. But there was this line here.
Typically, you trust your people too much, Commander. Caledonia has been under strict martial law since news of the Offworlders' arrival began to spread. Our domestic security remains intact.
Which implies the Caledonians don't have as much faith in their people. Given the Cold War angle between the two, we could theorize that the Caledonian Federation isn't as democratic as we may think based on the name. As for Soren's faction, we know that it was originally made up of multiple different groups of religious fundamentalists that he got to unite under him. He believed that people should live simple lives as laid out by the gods, and we know he wanted to spread his revolution to Caledonia. And I will say this for Soren, while many imply that he's only doing all this as a power grab, I genuinely think he believes in what he's preaching, and I don't know which is scarier, to be honest. Society. We sadly really can't glean much about the society of these factions because we don't really get to see much of them. For Rand, we hear something about an age of enlightenment, and given people become more secular over time, we can assume that at one point they were very religious. Although, as I said, this has now become a minority. Another thing is that apparently the Stargate has influenced some elements of their clothing, such as these necklaces here, or these, I guess, buttons maybe? Interestingly enough, the religious thing doesn't seem to affect Caledonia. Maybe their ancestors recognized the truth of the Goa'uld and the Rand only recently did, or maybe it's simply because Rand accepts the gods, they reject it because they hate anything to do with Rand. I don't know, it's just kind of a weird thing I noticed. Technology. Technologically, the Tegallians were somewhere close to where Earth was in the 1950s. Interestingly enough, as far as I can tell, they don't have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons is never said as far as I can tell, and there doesn't appear to be any nuclear winter or radiation after the war. So they only had conventional missiles, and between the two, we know Rand had the more accurate targeting systems. We also know both had radio jammers, and while I'm not an expert on real-world guns, I'm pretty sure this is an AK-47 used by a Rand Protectorate soldier. Obviously, they probably call it something different, but this is just something I recognize. Relations with other races. The relations of the Tegallians between themselves and others is what I can only describe as the Protectorate and the Federation hated each other, and the only thing they ever seemed to agree on was their hatred of Soren. And instead of allying together to stop him, they ended up destroying each other to the point that he could more easily take power. Rand had been both an enemy and ally of Earth. Soren was only tolerated by Earth for a short time. Caledonia, interestingly enough, never really seemed to be an enemy of Earth and only an ally that one time. And the Ori probably didn't care who they got as an ally. They ended up working with Rand, but had the situation been reversed and Rand had rejected it and Caledonia accepted it, then the Prior would have worked with Caledonia to make the satellite against Rand. Again, they probably didn't care who they worked with, though they probably wouldn't want to work with any remnant of Soren's faction. Interestingly enough, we don't really hear anything about a remnant Soren faction. I mean, I guess it's possible they were all wiped out, but still, it would be interesting to see their reaction to Ori, since basically it's a group coming in saying, your gods are wrong, our gods are right, worship them or else. In a hypothetical situation where the Tegallians didn't end up destroying themselves and moved on to the stars, I actually think Rand and Caledonia would have done pretty well for themselves. Rand seemed curious about how SG-1 were human, and if they learned that there were other humans throughout the galaxy, they'd probably see the opportunity to go out and make trade deals and alliances. The problem would be if they kept their rivalry going and didn't unite, and they began picking their allies and trade partners based on whether or not they were siding with Rand and Caledonia. As for Soren, if his group ended up using the gate, I doubt they'd find many friends. Most human groups would probably not want to work with them, since Soren would want to force the religion on them, and even the groups like the Bedrosians, their religious beliefs kind of clash with each other, so I don't think he'd find any allies there. And if he made his way to a Goa'uld world, he'd probably find out really quickly why most people don't like the Goa'uld. And that was the Tegallians, and I really like their story. A common thing I see in a lot of fiction is the idea that at some point in the future, Earth is going to unite under a central unified government. And one of the big things that pushes that is first contact with aliens, such as in the case of Star Trek First Contact with the Vulcans, or in Mass Effect The First Contact War. But what I like about the Tegallians is they show that may not be the case. Just because you make first contact doesn't mean you put aside your differences with your enemies, especially if there are deep-seated political issues. Like, I really don't see the United States and China merely putting aside their differences and getting all buddy-buddy simply because they meet a race of people with pointy ears. A defensive alliance against a threat maybe, but not really working together to make a central unified government. Another thing I like about their story is it raises the question of Earth's responsibility when it makes first contact with these people. It's funny that in earlier seasons, Stargate Command basically went wherever they wanted, made contact with whoever they wanted, consequences of what happened to the people they made contact with be damned. Like with the Irondans, Earth was more than willing to give them the ability to make weapons of mass destruction to get their technology. Consequences of what happened afterward be damned. And yes, there's examples we could point to where Earth came in and helped and was a generally good influence. But what's funny is because by the end of the series, they had implemented all these rules about making first contact and trading technology, ironically becoming more like the allies they often clashed with because of their refusal to give them technology. And it was around the Tegallians' first appearance that they really started to implement that. And again, the Tegallian story raises the question about Earth's responsibility. Was Earth responsible for what happened to Tegalis? Or the Tegallians themselves responsible for what happened to them? Tell me what you think in the comments below, and maybe leave a like and subscribe. And remember...
Commander Gareth.
In the name of the people of the Rand Protectorate, I welcome you.
A protectorate is a dependent territory that has been granted some level of autonomy from a greater sovereign state.